Hi, this is Steve Worona, and you're listening to Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Before I introduce today's webinar, here's a brief orientation to the Adobe Connect interface we're using. Your browser right now is showing the title slide for today's talk. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a box labeled Questions and Comments where you can read and type messages. There's a tab labeled Everyone at the bottom of this box, and that's the tab you'll use for all of your general messages, including questions and comments for our speakers. We'll be breaking for discussion several times during the presentation, so please do not hold your questions to the end. You can also send direct messages to a specific person by hovering your cursor over a name in the attendee list. One of those names is Technical Help, and that's the place to go if you run into technical problems. We're also monitoring Twitter for your questions and comments. Use hashtag NCCPSwebinar. If you missed part of today's conversation, or if you want to see some or all of it again, this webinar is being recorded and captioned. The link will be available on the NCCPS webinars page in about a week. And watch your email for a link to a brief evaluation survey requesting your reactions and comments on today's session. Please take a minute to respond to that survey when the link arrives. We do appreciate your feedback. And now for today's special 90-minute presentation. Our topic is the importance of learning from averted and completed school attacks, and we'll be hearing from three outstanding speakers with a wide range of expertise on this issue. Jeff Allison is the Director of Government and External Relations for IACLEA, the International Association of Campus Law Enforcement Administrators. In this role, Jeff serves as the primary liaison between IACLEA and federal agencies, Congress, and national associations of higher education that address campus public safety. Jeff was recently appointed to the National School Safety Consortium for the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, known as the COPS Office. He also represents campus law enforcement and public safety on the U.S. Attorney General's Law Enforcement Working Group. Frank Straub is Director of the Center for Mass Violence Response Studies for the National Police Foundation, a nonprofit organization that studies ways to improve policing in the United States. He has conducted in-depth studies of the San Bernardino terrorist attack, the Kalamazoo mass shooting, and the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting. He's currently leading a review of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting. Frank is the project manager of the Averted School Violence Database, an important free resource used to collect, analyze, and share information on both averted and completed acts of violence in schools that have occurred post-Columbine. We'll be hearing much more about the ASP Database during today's webinar. And finally, Kristina Anderson is the executive director and founder of the Koshka Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping local community and school stakeholders work together to prevent, respond, and heal in the aftermath of school violence. She founded the Koshka Foundation after becoming one of the most critically injured survivors from the 2007 Virginia Tech tragedy. Frank, Jeff, and Kristina, welcome to Campus Public Safety Online. Jeff, I believe you're going to kick things off.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Kim Richmond, and all of the staff at the National Center for Campus Public Safety for hosting this webinar. Thanks also to the United States Department of Justice for its funding of the National Center. Most of all, thank you to everyone that's on this call today, on this webinar. We appreciate you joining us. Dr. Straub and I'm sorry, let me back up one slide. The Reader's Digest version of this slide is that Dr. Straub and I are going to provide you with an overview of the National Averted School Violence Database, its purpose, how we got here, and how you might be able to benefit from the database. Following our presentations, then Kristina Anderson will share lessons learned from Virginia Tech that apply to school and campus safety today. Sadly, this has become an iconic photo in American history. Everyone on the webinar, I'm sure, knows where this picture was taken, when it was taken, and why it was taken in terms of what was happening. And I suspect that if we put up a photo of the attacker in this instance, even without a name caption, everybody would know who that was. This individual may not be as familiar to you. Those in campus law enforcement may recognize the face, but for others you may not. His name is James C Becomeu. He was a student at the University of Central Florida from 2010 to 2012. but did not enroll for the spring 2013 semester. The school was in the process of evicting him from his dorm, for lack of a better term, but he had a different plan. He acquired an assault rifle, a .45 caliber pistol, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, high-capacity magazines, and he constructed 4 homemade bombs. He had a written plan and a timeline that involved pulling the fire alarm in his dormitory at midnight and then shooting students as they tried to evacuate from the dorm through the hallways. At midnight, he pulled the alarm and was retrieving weapons from his dorm room when another student saw him with the assault rifle and called 911. As police arrived on scene, he took his own life. The last item on his checklist said, "Give them hell." That's a case that's as close to a near miss as you can possibly get. This individual, his name is James Howard. In March of 2016, he was a student at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, medium-sized public university in the Midwest. He withdrew from school, and on the same day that he withdrew from school, he assaulted his hockey coach. He had been a hockey player at Ohio University. He assaults his hockey coach, leaves the university, and attempts to purchase a weapon at a gun store, but the owner refuses to sell to him based on statements that he made about harming himself and others. He left the store irate, came back at one point. The gun store owner locked all the doors so he couldn't get back in, and James Howard left and went to a Walmart nearby where he was in the process of buying camouflage clothes, gloves, and more ammunition when the police confronted him and took him into custody. They found a rifle in his car that he had purchased at another store and mental health papers. He left his cell phone in his hometown, which was also in eastern Ohio, but a ways away. Investigators believe that he did that to throw police off from his location after he carried out his attack. The county sheriff is convinced that the alert gun owner prevented a mass casualty shooting at the university. One interesting thing that's come out of this particular case that I would like to share with you is that the National Shooting Sports Foundation and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention are working together to educate gun store owners about warning signs. And so I encourage, especially the law enforcement officials that are on the line today, on the webinar today, that you may want to do outreach with your local gun stores. The National Shooting Sports Foundation actually has literature online that you can take with you and share with them, again, about warning signs. So in terms of the purpose and the history of the National Averted School Violence Database, the point is that we track and we study completed attacks in minute detail, but we don't do the same with averted attacks. With Virginia Tech, there were at least 3 commission reports done, very, very in-depth studies, one by the university, one by the Commonwealth of Virginia, and one by the federal government, but we know far less about the threats that were averted at the University of Central Florida, Ohio University, and many others around the country. After Sandy Hook, Congress created the Comprehensive School Safety Initiative, making funds available to the U.S. Department of Justice to conduct research on school violence, especially mass casualty attacks. And $75 million was appropriated to the National Institute of Justice. The Department of Justice convened a working group to try to design approaches to using this appropriation in studying school violence. I was fortunate enough to be on that working group representing the FBI, and we agreed that we needed a National Averted School Violence Database for 2 reasons. First, only by tracking and studying completed and averted attacks do we have a comprehensive picture of the true threat environment for our schools. Second, we need to study averted attacks in order to identify and understand the factors that allowed school and law enforcement officials to prevent potentially catastrophic events. Aggregating this information allows school administrators and law enforcement executives to make more informed policy, training, and procurement decisions to protect their students. A third thing I would point out is that studying near misses is a very common practice in the aviation industry as well as medicine. In law enforcement, we do have the near miss portal here at the National Police Foundation, and it was for that reason that the COPS office made an award to the National Police Foundation to establish the National Averted School Violence Database. Originally, the database was focused on K through 12. The COPS office recently made an award to IACLEA to expand the database to cover colleges and universities. In conclusion, for my remarks, I would say that we need everyone on this webinar to do two things. First of all, if you become aware of an averted attack, let's get it into the database. At minimum, if you let me know about it, then I can work to get it in the database. And the second thing that we would ask you to do is go to the database, which is asvnearmiss.org, and register so you can access the reports in the database. You have to be vetted before you can gain full access to those reports. So please go to asvnearmiss.org and register. The National Police Foundation staff will vet you, and you will be given access to the library, the resource library. I encourage you to use these cases, use the cases in the database when you're doing presentations, when you're trying to make the case for prevention. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Straub.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Jeff. We were going to pause here to take some questions, and let's see if we do have some coming in. We do, Jeff, Lisa Terwilliger, before you had given had said the last few things that you said, wondered who had access to this database. And I can infer, I think, from what you said, that anybody can connect and ask for access. I've moved back to your last slide. But you said people had to be vetted, and perhaps you could say something about the vetting process?
Sure. Law enforcement officials, school officials, mental health will have contact, will have access after vetting to the database. Access is not given, for instance, to the media. The media can certainly look at the reports that the Police Foundation issues that are compilations of cases, but they are not given access to individual cases. So if you are a law enforcement official or a school official or mental health practitioner with a nexus to schools, then yes, you will be granted access.
Thanks. That's very helpful. What is the definition of an averted attack?
Sure, Steve. The definition is posted at the website, and I'll read it to you. An averted school violence incident is a shooting, bombing, stabbing, or other violent attack that was prevented either before or after the potential perpetrator arrived on school grounds, before any injury or loss of life occurred at the educational institution.
Thanks. Let's see, we're going to squeeze a couple of more in here during this break, but let me say while I'm thinking of it now, keep those questions coming in. We have several breaks scheduled during the presentation. Don't hold them to the end. TG wonders where to go to request access. You read out the URL. It's not on the screen. Perhaps read it again, and Andrea, if you could capture it and type it into the chat.
Sure. It is www.asv, phonetically that would be Adam, Sam, Victor, nearmiss, that's all one word, .org. And what happens is when you go to that database, to that URL, click on Browse Reports, and then you are able to click on any report that pops up, and that's going to take you to a prompt screen where you'll enter information about your name, your email address, and what your nexus is to school safety.
And one more before we move on, Jessica Johnson. So this database is solely near misses?
The database actually includes some completed attacks for purposes of comparison, and Dr. Straub is going to get into that a little bit more in a minute. But yes, it was primarily set up to capture averted attacks.
Thank you, Jeff. And as I said, keep those questions coming. We'll get to them in following breaks. We won't lose any of them. But Frank, thanks for letting me get those questions in there. Let me turn the floor over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you, everybody, for being on the call today. More importantly, thank you for the very important work that you all do to keep our students and our schools safe. So a little bit about the database, as Jeff said, you see on the screen right now. It is asvnearmiss.org. Right now we have approximately 100 plus incident reports on averted and completed acts of violence in the schools. That number increases on a daily basis as we either find cases out there in public domain or individuals like the listeners report them through the ASPnearmiss.org website. Originally, as Jeff said, we collected K through 12 information, but due to funding from the Department of Justice COPS office, we've been able to bring college and universities into the ASP database. The starting point is 1999 through the present. All the information in the database is freely available to law enforcement, school personnel, mental health professionals, and others involved in school safety and attack prevention. So if you want to submit a report, as you can see on this screenshot, you go to the website, and there is a section there that indicates submit a report. The report is reviewed and identifying information is removed. So we have an intake person at the National Police Foundation who goes through the process of making sure that any information that would identify the reporter, the school, victims, excuse me, perpetrators are removed and scrubbed. In addition to that, a second group of personnel, subject matter experts that are mental health practitioners, school safety, law enforcement professionals, then go through to make sure that it was properly scrubbed, sanitized, and they also go through to look for lessons learned that we can then share through reports, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Reports are published in the Browse Reports section, and as Steve said earlier, only individuals that are vetted by the National Police Foundation ASV team can view incident-level reports. What have we learned so far? Well, we've done two different analyses. The first analysis was done by Professor Jeff Daniels, where he looked at 51 averted attacks. A second analysis was done by myself and Dr. Peter Langman, who is a psychologist in Pennsylvania, who's written 2 books on school shooters. And what we did is we compared completed attacks to averted attacks. What information did we study? We looked at school information, safety and security issues, the size of the student body, the geographical location in terms of where that school was located. We looked at perpetrator information, behavioral personal histories, their reason for the attack if known. How was the plot discovered and prevented? What was the perpetrator's plan? And we think that this is critically important, this section in terms of prevention, right? How is this attack stopped? What lessons are there? How can we share those lessons to the broader school safety community? So what we see in averted attacks, the student peers were most often the first to discover the plotter's plan for violence. And you see out of the 51 cases that in 29 cases, peers were the individuals who became aware and reported the plan or the attack to school officials, law enforcement, parents, etc. The next group was school personnel, a group of other, which could be parents, it could be neighbors, it could be a variety of sources, followed by law enforcement, and so on. What was the relationship of the perpetrator to the school? What we see that is that in 76.5% of the averted cases, the perpetrator or potential perpetrator was a current student. In 58.9% of the completed cases, the perpetrator was a current student. The next largest category was 13.7%, of the perpetrators were former students or potential perpetrators in averted cases, and 23.5 in completed cases. And then we see the smallest category being school officials with 1.9% of the potential, or actually the perpetrators in completed attacks. We don't have any record right now of school officials being involved in averted attacks. Perpetrator information. In completed attacks, at least 19 perpetrators were known to the criminal justice system prior to the attacks. Interestingly, in averted attacks, only about 9 perpetrators were known to the criminal justice system prior to the planned attack. Some of the takeaways for school and law enforcement. It's very important that we educate students and teachers about warning signs for violence, as well as suicide and depression. We need to develop well-trained threat assessment teams. Over 80% of averted and completed attacks were planned, executed by current or former students and school employees. Can't stress enough that those threat assessment teams need to be well-trained, they need to be well-practiced, and they really need to be collaborative. They need to include law enforcement, school resource officers, mental health professionals, school counselors, and in many cases we even see parents being included in school threat assessment teams. Very, very important is to proactively seek to identify student safety concerns. We don't want to be in a situation where we're waiting for at-risk individuals to pop up on the radar screen. We want to be looking for these individuals, not just around school safety concerns or student safety concerns, but can we identify individuals that could pose a threat, that may be spiraling into a situation where they really need services, and maybe we can prevent a suicide. Maybe we can prevent even something as simple as a fight. Maybe we can prevent a school attack if we're able to identify those at-risk individuals, those individuals that are in need of help, and get them connected to services very quickly. For law enforcement, very important to make sure that they are familiar with the school, that they do walkthroughs through the school, not just the school resource officers, but officers that might be responding to a school environment. Make sure that there is school breaching equipment available, that patrol officers have that ability, that they also have the ability and the knowledge to potentially override school locking systems that may be electronic, to give them quick access into the school, into classrooms, and other parts of the facility. It's also very important to have an anonymous reporting system that is trusted by students. And I think one way to do that, to build that trust, is to show positives in the reporting system. That an anonymous report came in, a student was identified, that student was helped. And a lot of detail isn't always necessary, but I think students and faculty and parents need to see that there's actually a value in the reporting system, and that there's encouragement for them to participate in such a reporting system. Again, for law enforcement, as I said earlier, make sure that they have access to school floor plans beforehand, become personally familiar with the buildings by doing walkthroughs regularly. A crisis is not the time to be learning a school facility of any size, shape, or form. We do have some forthcoming materials. We have a Averted School Violence User Guide that will help individuals walk through the Averted School database. We will have, as I mentioned earlier, a report by Jeff Daniels that addresses averted school attacks, and then a report by Dr. Langman and myself. Those last two reports should be coming out fairly soon. Hopefully the federal government shutdown ends quickly, and we'll be able to make those reports available to all of you and the public more broadly.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you very much.
Let's pick up some of the questions we've gotten. Chris Havens from Dallas Baptist University apparently saw an event and tried to make a report through the database, but says he couldn't answer all of the questions in the report process and wondering if there's a phone number that he could report to. Jeff, Frank, which of you can take that?
I'll take it. This is Frank. Chris, thank you for your question. It's a good question for all of the participants today. If you do run into a problem, Brett Cowell, C-O-W-E-L-L, at Police Foundation, or B. Cowell at policefoundation.org would be your first stop. My email is fstraub, S-T-R-A-U-B, at policefoundation.org. If any of you encounter problems, either getting into the website or making an incident report, reach out to either Brett or I, and we will take care of you and help you get access.
Thanks, Frank. Daniel Hickson notes that on slide 15, the number of attacks known to law enforcement was listed. He's wondering what's the total number of incidents?
Total number of incidents in the database right now? Or
I think it's an issue of known to law enforcement, and I'm not sure how you'd know what's not known to law enforcement, but I'm inferring that the issue is how complete the number known to law enforcement is compared to the total number.
Okay, so this was out of the 51 completed attacks and the 51 averted. So those are your numbers.
Yes.
51 was our sample size. So 19 out of 51 were known to law enforcement. 9 were known to, had prior criminal justice contact prior to discovery. So it's just out of that 51 sample size.
Julie wonders, are attempted and successful suicides included with the statistics?
They are not.
Randy Campbell wonders, based upon plot discovery statistics, isn't it vital to deliver solid training methods to the student populations and how to mitigate these incidents? Initially, example for alert and craze, in essence, developing a first responder mindset.
We think that it's very important that individuals, particularly those involved in school safety and security, as well as students, have access, that they also have access to the reports, which I said will be forthcoming, and really read the reports and share amongst themselves and have discussions about the lessons learned. The whole idea of this database is to learn from what didn't happen, what was stopped, what at-risk students were identified and connected to resources that prevented a school attack. None of us want to be in the position of having to watch the news, having to have a loved one suffer, have our community suffer from a completed attack. So we believe that very intentional and thoughtful attention to averting the attacks and sharing that information is critical. And so, as Jeff said, I would also urge everyone participating to populate this database. We only can learn from each other. And so the more cases we can bring into the database, the better opportunity we have to share that opportunity.
Let me squeeze in one more question. This is a question that came in during the registration process. Somebody wonders if there's a significant difference or differences between the K through 12 setting and colleges and universities as it applies to this topic.
Jeff, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Frank. Certainly in terms of protecting educational facilities, there's a huge difference. Many of our large universities are really many cities, and which makes it much more difficult to protect them in the event of attack. In terms of preventing attacks in the Averted School Violence Database, again, we recommend in both settings trusted anonymous reporting systems. Trusted meaning that students, whether they're K through 12 or college level, will use them. And we find that one of the key things in building trust is for students to understand that these systems are not intended to be punitive, that they are, in fact, intended to identify people who may be on that pathway to violence, let us intervene and help that person and hopefully get them back into the community. So it's much easier, again, from a prevention standpoint. I think some of the approaches are the same, understanding age differences and developmental capabilities when it comes to actually responding to events that do occur. Certainly, it can be a much more complex environment when you're talking about a campus, a college, university, as opposed to a K through 12 setting. And if the person asking that question would like to explore more, please email me, and my email is on the last slide. Then the other thing, Steve, if I may, respond to Randy's question about craze. Yes, we would agree that just as important as it is important to train first responders, the Department of Justice funds a program called ALERT, Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training. But an offshoot of that is CRAZE, which is designed to teach school officials and other civilians that may be caught up in a mass casualty attack. Yes, we do agree that it's essential to train them, that students be trained, again, trained in a way that's appropriate given developmental level for the children at different ages. But then again, most important that our students are learning, and parents as well, what the warning signs are. And for parents in particular, I would say that they need to be encouraged to monitor social media, monitor the social media use of their students. And so it's got to be a comprehensive approach. But yes, just like we train first responders, we also need to be training people who are not law enforcement or EMTs in our schools.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Frank. They are not leaving us, and we are not going to lose the questions that have come in. But I'm now going to turn the floor over to Christina.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone, and thank you to the National Center for Campus Public Safety for gathering us today. It is an honor to be part of this conversation on this very important topic with Jeff and Frank as well. My name is Kristina Anderson. I started a nonprofit called the Koshka Foundation for Safe Schools shortly after the events in 2007 at Virginia Tech. For any of you that might have taken Russian as a foreign language, you might recognize the word koshka. It just means little cat in Russian. It's a family nickname I've had since growing up. It has nothing to do with school safety. But currently, just as background, we are a nonprofit, and this originated, kind of the genesis of this was from just funds that people sent to my family and friends in recovery. I was wounded at Virginia Tech. I was shot 3 times, which I'll share with you here in a few minutes. But the focus of the work, we work with kind of different organizations from higher ed, K-12, other kind of public spaces on hoping how can we help prevent this event from happening in their spaces in the first place. Then doing sometimes things like CRAZE or active threat, run, hide, fight response in age and tone appropriate language and ways. And then also do a lot of work in connecting survivors of different causes. And so if by chance you happen to have a student or a principal or a teacher who's been either in proxy to the space or themselves physically wounded, happy to help find individuals that have had a similar experience to them as well. The way that we do this is by pairing kind of personal survivor narrative to help establish the importance of this, either prevented or usually currently it's completed attacks, with then some discussions for how to help prevent this from happening in the first place. So I'll open by quickly just sharing with you my personal story and what brought me into this work, take a quick break for Q&A, and then share some resources for prevention as well. This photograph is myself. This is going back to April of 2007. I can't hear all of you on the line personally, but feel free to laugh, chuckle. Don't take a screenshot, please, whatever you do. I was a sophomore at Virginia Tech, and I used this photograph really to illustrate that I was not thinking about safety and security really whatsoever. but the environment that kind of allowed this to continue was my campus at Virginia Tech, which I'm sure many of you have visited or also have studied the event. To give you a space of where this event occurred, we had at the time about 28,000 students. It's a large, open, beautiful campus. It's, heavily focused on research and athletics and things like that. We thankfully have at the time, and still do today, a sworn campus law enforcement at Virginia Tech. And so our chief of police for the campus is in very close communication with our local town of Blacksburg, both through relationship building and actual training for similar things. They are very well prepared, and this will make, as you can imagine, a huge impact the day of our shooting. The morning of the 16th, I was an international studies major at Virginia Tech, and I had a French classroom inside Norris Hall. As I'm sure many of you on the call today are similarly very aware of, where are my exits, where are my doors, and things like that. That was not me as a 19-year-old on the campus. And so Norris Hall is interesting from the perspective of that. It has been described as a fortress. It is it's a very good place to lock down. As you can tell from the photograph, it is an older kind of concrete building. The walls will start to muffle and kind of confuse the initial sounds of gunfire. It's an L-shaped building. What you're seeing here is the front of the space, and to the right it kind of extends out into a longer hallway. But again, the doors to this space are extremely, extremely heavy and thick. These are the original doors. And going back to previous comments on the importance of breaching devices for law enforcement, this will become one of the main takeaways because our law enforcement, unfortunately, were not able to break in as quickly as it would have liked because the perpetrator had chained the door shut from the inside as part of his research and planning for this attack. The windows are going to be very hard to break out, and so it's a very good place to trap people if that is your intent. Our perpetrator, who was a student at Virginia Tech, he purchased 3 chains for 3 doors, as I mentioned, about 2 weeks prior to when the attack occurred. And he also engaged, as you'll see a little bit later, in many other activities to help make sure this was a successful space. The photograph that you're seeing here, this is the hallway where the shooting actually occurred. My classroom was about halfway down. Let's see if I can get this to work. About here, about 211, halfway down the hallway. This is what the space looks like today following a multi-million-dollar renovation. Now, there's many reasons why obviously it's important to focus on the prevention of these attacks, the human loss and impact, the organizational, the institutional. But from a fairly kind of policy-driven perspective, there's also a lot of conversations about what do you do with the space afterwards? Who wants to return to work in these spaces? We're going to have many students who have to return to Norris Hall to finish out their graduate research studies and things like that as part of their graduation requirements. And they're just, questions that one doesn't want to face, so we hope to do the preventive work in advance. Today, the right side of this hallway is the Center for Peace Studies and Violence Prevention. The left side are mechanical and engineering labs. And so the interior walls have been broken down. The classrooms do not exist as they did that day. But if you were there at the time, you can kind of figure out, where you were at that time. My classroom was about halfway down the hallway. We sat in the back left-hand corner of the room. From a structural perspective, please keep in mind, none of our doors at this point had interior locks. Today, and by great praise to our chief of police and many other things they did to help us return to the campus, all of our doors have interior push function locks, just in case you had to secure that space. We also have in the larger classrooms now kind of very large, almost TV-like emergency notification screens if you had to lock down or to evacuate and things like that. For the most of the day, they just show the date and the time in that script. But shortly after I walked into Norris Hall, the perpetrator followed suit. He came in with 400 rounds of ammunition, 2 handguns, 3 chains, and a knife that he did not use. And he did not start firing in our classroom, but kind of further down the hall. And to me, it sounded like, an axe being taken to a piece of wood. It was a very quick, kind of sharp sound. And I was sitting on the kind of facing this hallway, so I could feel the intensity as he's moving up. I saw my professor peer outside. She quickly came back in. She said, call 911. And very quickly, I got to the ground. This is an older building, so if you recall, like those desks that you slide into them, you put your arm around, they're 1-unit desks. I put my feet under the chair. my stomach on the seat, just covered my head with my hands, trying to make myself as small as I could. And as he unfortunately burst in, he wounded them first, went to the other side of the classroom, and opened fire. I've been asked, very often by law enforcement and others, how quickly did it happen? From hearing him in the hallway to being inside of our space is maybe 5-7 seconds. It's incredibly fast. It felt very planned. It felt very methodical, very very intent. He didn't say anything. He didn't pause. He just opened fire the entire time. To give you a sense of how quickly, unfortunately, our classroom was taken by surprise, every single person but one will be wounded in the attack. The first time that I was wounded was in the back, being shot. What it feels like is just a hot, heavy burn. It feels like a very quick pinch. And as it travels in your body, once it stops, then that burning just gets worse and worse and worse. So it really kind of starts to seep in. He will leave our classroom several times, so he really stays the entire time on this hallway. We're going to have some classrooms where one professor will use his body to keep the door closed, and that allows about 10 students to jump 19.5 feet from the windowsill down to the sidewalk. So they will have broken limbs, broken arms, all of that, but they thankfully survive. We have some individuals who survive under other people, under other desks. I mean, this is a very, very, as you can kind of see, restrictive environment to be moving around in. So we don't want people facing with these kinds of decisions. The best case of active threat response is actually in classroom 205, which is all the way down here. About 2 of their folks will go in the hallway to tell what they thought was construction workers to be quiet. As I mentioned, a lot of the sounds were initially misconstrued. When they ran back in their classroom, they told their classmates, and about half of them will add desks and use their bodies to keep the door closed. So when he did try to kick through the door and shoot through the door, he thankfully missed them and kind of shot straight through the center of the door, and the bolts went out the windows. So he never actually gained access into that space. From a recovery aspect, as you think about your unique kind of cases, I ask you to think of the term survivors as including all of those that are, proxy and are in the space of that attack, not just those that are physically wounded. Those 11 students, those 10 students and a TA, they stayed in that classroom for another hour. And so not only did they hear the entire 11 and a half minutes of this attack, but when they were finally evacuated, they actually saw what later obviously became a crime scene. He came into our classroom 2 more times. I was shot again at that point, and then we know the third time he actually walked over and saw law enforcement make a successful entry into this space, which was when he took his own life. The shooting in total lasted about 11 and a half minutes, but unfortunately in that amount of time, he wounded and killed 30 individuals inside Norris Hall. As many of you are familiar, we actually had 2 attacks that day. In the morning shooting, Wes Ambler Johnson, he killed 2 students. So it is one of the worst attacks in higher education. As many of my colleagues in kind of school safety and violence prevention often do point out, though, I want us to remember that this is by far one of the more lethal attacks. It is not the first attack in a college setting, and they're all equally important to remember. But I do want to just briefly share with you the students from my classroom who passed away. We lost 11 students and my professor in that span of 12 minutes, and so. We do stay in touch. When I say we, I mean the other survivors, thinking with staying in touch with their family, their friends, and individuals in that regard. And if I could just, also make a point and a stress to the importance of remembering all of the victims, survivors, and families, and not just those that have a higher amount of people wounded and things like that. People often feel marginalized that their events might be forgotten. I was put here on the right side of the hallway and kind of finally picked up and carried out when this photograph was taken that I'm sure many of you have seen. This is me on the right in the white shirt. The gentleman behind me is my friend Colin Goddard, who's also one of the students who was wounded that day and survived. Some of you on the webinar, I think, know me personally as well, and I often joke this is not my favorite photograph. I don't think it's my best angle by any sense of the stretch. In great kudos to our first responders. I cannot express how thankful and appreciative I am to all of we had the town of Blacksburg police, our Virginia Tech police officers. We had 3 SWAT teams make successful entry, and they are, for the big part, the reason why we are still alive today, but also to our EMS. We had 2 tactical medics enter the building with our officers, and so the about 17 of us that are wounded but are alive at the end of the shooting are all taken out within about 30-35 minutes to to the two main hospitals that are there. So extremely grateful for their work and for their training and for their response. I lost 2/3 of my right kidney, my gallbladder, parts of my large and small intestines, and so needless to say, I did not return to Virginia Tech that semester. I was able to pick my own grades, and I got a really good GPA. I always have to point out, I'm very grateful. My cousin was born 2 days after the shooting. That's me meeting him for the first time. But obviously that summer was when physical recovery and healing and things like that began. It took about 2 to 3 months to finally be able to walk, to sit upright, and things like that. If any of you have a chance to either Google image or return to our campus, I know several of you have actually visited our space. This is our memorial. It is 32 Hokie stones, one for each of the individuals who lost their lives. As you'll see kind of throughout the rest of the presentation, it is intentional that you will not see his photograph, the individual that shot us and carried out this attack. I think by now we've all caught on to this the sense of no notoriety and the importance of, while it's important to study their behaviors and their writings and things that could have been seen, pre-attack, kind of pre-incident behaviors, it's not as important to focus on their manifestos and their photographs in that way. So when you speak to your students, your faculty, your staff, your parents, I ask you to also think of that balance of not highlighting the individuals versus the first responders and the communities that they serve. So with that, I think we want to take a quick pause and a break to address if there are any questions on this portion of my experience. And as I often say, please do not be shy, do not hold back. I've been asked, different types of questions. Nothing you say will cross the line.
Thanks so much, Kristina. And my sense is that our audience is not holding back. Kristina, you returned to Virginia Tech to finish your studies for 2 more years and to graduate. From a recovery perspective, what were some of the issues that survivors face in returning to study, and how did the university help your recovery?
Of course, yes. So the university, they created what was called, and still actually is in existence today, just to a smaller degree. It's called the Office of Recovery and Support, and that team was made up of someone with kind of background in student athletics, mental health, counseling, and therapy, and they gathered all the different survivors. We would have dinners, we would have meetings, kind of meet, and keep in mind, in a lot of these cases, the individuals, they don't always know each other, and so having a safe space to share experiences, and you'd be surprised how often when I meet with schools or workplaces where they have attacks occurred, people are very shy to go back and reach out to that person, but it can be very helpful for us to feel like we're not forgotten and that the institution actually cares about the experience, 2, 3, whatever years down the line. I still receive Christmas cards from Virginia Tech from some folks that work at this office, and other things. But immediately going back to the States, things like they offer to tell our professors on our behalf that we were inside of Norris Hall at the time. And the reason this was helpful was, A, they gave us the agency to say, yes, please do or don't. But it also gave the professors a little bit of advance notice that, around the anniversary or if there's another, attack and, whatever might be happening, that we might be at a heightened stance of anxiety, that we might need consideration with deadlines or exams. They just might be more flexible because every professor, every person you interact with is obviously very different, and their stance on it might be that, no, this is when it's due, but if you're having a panic attack, it's not, that helpful. As some of you might recall, the Northern Illinois University shooting happened, only a few months after ours. And Virginia Tech, in that case and many others, was very kind. I would get a phone call saying a mass notification is about to go out. Just give you a heads up in that regard. So that was very helpful. And also I would advise if you're going to have anniversaries or remembrance events to involve the students. And as I mentioned, not just those that are physically wounded, but anyone kind of in that space who may have heard, seen, felt the attack. Just ask them for their thoughts. You do not have to include every single person's, suggestions. Obviously, it's not always possible, but people really appreciate that initial consideration, and they will always remember how that interaction made them feel, and that counts for a lot, kind of going forward and how they remember the event. And so a high percentage, almost all of the survivors that were in that space, we all came back to the university. And I think that speaks very highly to what a great job they did in supporting us throughout that time.
Kristina, Dana says, thank you for sharing. Please keep on emphasizing that safety is personal. Beth Eden says, thank you so much, Kristina, for allowing us to hear your story. Chris Haven says, Kristina, thank you for continuing to share your story. And Nikki Barone says, kudos for the trauma-sensitive response by Virginia Tech. Ronnie Hall wonders, what is the mission of the Koshka Foundation? Perhaps that's something you're going to get to, or do you want to touch on that now?
No, I'm happy to touch on that, absolutely, because the work has kind of evolved in different ways. At its main sense is to help people in the public that don't normally interact with these types of questions, so I'm talking about parents, students, faculty, to be aware of things like threat assessment and threat management, to be aware of things like, whether it's run, hide, fight, or if we're talking about active threat response, and to help them understand that it's their responsibility to be partners with all of you in that space. And the way that I'm hoping to kind of seek that work is by developing resources, videos, documentaries that you all could use to help get buy-in. I think one of the things that we all understand is it's really difficult to start this conversation with parents and other students during times of when attack hasn't occurred and try to remind them to be proactive and to be helpful. And so I think the mission is trying to forge greater connections between the community and, let's say, law enforcement, for instance, or threat assessment teams, but also make the public more aware that these events are preventable, but they have a certain duty to report, to speak up, to ask questions, to be more informed. I think all of you would be, it's still a little bit shocking. I'm sure all of you, and I do too, we travel places where someone will say, this will never happen here. And we have these images that Littleton and Newtown and Blacksburg are somehow these, very different places than the spaces that they inhabit, and that's just not true. And I just hope to do that and without scaring people too much in the process.
There's been a great deal of conversation in the chat room about the Stop the Bleed campaign, which is described as designed to cultivate grassroots efforts that encourage bystanders to become trained, equipped, and empowered to help in a bleeding emergency before professional help arrives. And Chris Havens, who you've heard from before, suggests that there should be a bleeding control kit next to every AED in every building and floor. Kristina or Jeff or Frank, do any of you have any comments on the Stop the Bleed campaign or other similar activities that campuses perhaps should look into?
This is
Kristina.
Frank. Oh, go ahead, Kristina, after you.
Oh, no, thank you, Frank. I was going to say, no, it's a great campaign. I'm really happy to hear that a lot of schools are seeking different ways to get funding for those kits. A lot of times it can, depending on caliber, things like that, they're not always lethal wounds. I just hope that that type of training happens comprehensively along with prevention training as well, that it's not, because, Stop the Bleed is still only talking to once an attack has occurred. I hope it's part of a larger culture of safety curriculum for that community, which I think it is.
And Frank, you were going to say?
Yeah, I would just add, I think, while Chris is right, having the kits by AEDs is good, but I think having them in each classroom is essential. I think, as Kristina mentioned, in this case, the perpetrator chained the doors, which delayed law enforcement response into the building. We see complications in the response in getting to victims in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and in other cases. I think preparing people for self-care and being able to take care of each other before law enforcement can get there would potentially save additional lives. But I agree 100% with Kristina. We can't be so focused on the response. We really have to be thinking about prevention, preparedness, because we don't want to have to be here telling these stories and listening to these stories anymore. But I think having people trained in trauma care, CPR, and having the materials available to them is critical.
Thanks, Frank. We've got time for one more question in this break, and I'm going to go back to one that arrived earlier, perhaps for Jeff, from Dave Rosinski. At what level do you label something an averted attack? For example, a student tells a friend that he wants to kill someone, but no credible evidence was found, such as guns or plans. Jeff?
Sure, Steve, and thank you for the question. Certainly, these incidents can occur anywhere along the pathway to violence, with ideation being the first step. the second being planning, followed by procurement, surveillance, and the fourth step being execution. And if you look at the database, we've got averted cases in there that occur at different points along that pathway. Certainly a social media threat that upon investigation is nothing more than an inappropriate and in many cases criminal expression would not be in the averted case database. But what we're looking for is ideation where the person has expressed an explicit intent to attack, either express that to other students on social media or maybe in a journal. An investigation reveals that. So you may see averted cases, averted attack cases where it had not gotten to the point where the individual had procured weapons, but they had, in fact, articulated a plan.
Jeff, thanks a lot. Christina, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jumping into a little bit more on the prevention piece, and I share this as you hear about this, kind of think about how you can help infuse this into the training and communication that you give to your teachers, faculty, staff, and parents as well. And one of the questions that I'm often asked, and I'm sure Jeff and Frank also come across, is, did I know the shooter at Virginia Tech? Did I know him personally? Just as quick background, he was described as being selectively mute, very quiet, painful to hear him speak, and very little social contact. And so one of the reasons why you will not see his photograph is that there is no accurate profile of a mass, we'll say mass shooter, but really any kind of active assailant. And what they all have in common is, perceived, actual, or anticipated loss or grievance. And this, the root can be things like distress, lack of getting a job, or failing a class, or a breakup, or divorce, things like that. A lack of resiliency and coping skills. There was only one individual that our perpetrator had what you would call, I guess, a social strong contact, who was his sister, who was in college in New Jersey at the time, so very far away from Virginia Tech. And the way that this applies to all of us, I think, on the call, is how do we as institutions help foster a culture of communication and reaching out to individuals and being very thoughtful to make sure that which of your students, don't have friends, for instance, or don't have someone to sit with. And it's going to help them make sure that it's a very inclusive environment in that way. I would say this is probably not new since 2007. We've understood that people do not just snap, they pre-plan these events, but I just urge you to help kind of adding this information into the communication that you give to your constituents. So when you do prevention training or active threat response, it's not in response to an event, not because something had happened or because this is an unsafe city, municipality, whatever it is. It's that we want to continue this to be the case. And those are the words that I use when I'm visiting a space as well. Just quick background, I'm sure many of you have read, and if you're not familiar with the Safe School Initiative, this is one of the first studies at K-12 targeted attacks shortly after Columbine High School. And this is the first thing that I read after Virginia Tech that really brought me into the space of the possibility that this is a preventable act. And again, I'm sure many of you read this, but I reissue these because you'll be shocked how many people, from the teachers that work in our schools to our parents, are not aware of these findings. Now, to be fair, the Safe School Initiative only looked at student perpetrators, so we have to be mindful that the perpetrators might be parents as well, former coworkers of that space, and it's obviously only K-12. But this is a great kind of foundational space for, I apologize for the background noise. That would be me on my end. This is a great foundational thing to say, a kind of a reference that as we study new attacks and previous attacks, that this is in continuation of previous findings. Often, this is where the origination comes from, when we hear others knew of the plan. I want to be clear here, how do I say this? The depth of the data here, we're not always positively sure. What they were aware of here was either the individual's desire to commit violence or their capability for carrying out those attacks. And so this kind of chimes back into the importance of why we want to communicate to our institutions that they should speak up about whatever they might be hearing in that regard. This chart is extremely, I know, a little bit confusing, but very important. So you may have seen this before from different presentations. It was put together from information that was reported and gleaned after our event was carried out from the Office of Inspector General. And all these different buckets are just different groups of our campus at Virginia Tech. And each of these arrows represent a communication pathway about our perpetrator being either suspicious, creepy, or odd. These are still very low-level behaviors. They are not violent in any way. The first day he was ever violent was the morning of the shooting. Now, some of these arrows are not, one-to-one. So, for instance, the concerned students to faculty is about 8 different interactions. What he was doing, for instance, the perpetrator would sit in classrooms, ask to be referred to as question mark, just write very graphic plays and poems about committing mass violence. So again, things that are yet not egregious or by not even violating student conduct, but are just a little bit strange. And so when we talk about, that gut in your stomach, this is when we want people to report information. And this is not meant to point any blame at any one entity at Virginia Tech. The issue, as you can tell here, is that we did not have at the time in place a policy or model in any way that would allow for any one individual or team on our campus to be able to collect and to understand all this information and to make any reasonable conclusions from that. As Dr. Jeff Pollard from George Mason University often says, you have to collect all the dots, so collect all the information before you can connect them. So all of this, just to give you reference, all of these behaviors, all of these different meetings are happening 18 months prior to when the attack occurred. So after the semester in time, most of his faculty assume that he has graduated, left Virginia Tech. In reality, he starts to engage in behaviors that are very directly related to the attack. So acquiring weapons, practicing with the weapons at a gun range, purchasing the chains and things like that. So we want all these arrows to be pointing towards the center, towards one group of people that are trained and are able to ascertain whether this is actually a real threat or concern or not. I want to be clear, in 80, maybe 90% of the cases that threat assessment teams would work are not going to become violent perpetrators. There's often many things you can do from a safety planning perspective to keep them safe in that environment. The issue is we don't know. And so as was previously mentioned, to kind of give you the definition of threat assessment and threat management, this became law in Virginia after our incident for higher education, later for K-12 following Sandy Hook in Newtown, Connecticut. And it's a group of people that sit and they do a thorough analysis and check of, okay, we have a social media post or a report from a concerned faculty member or student. Is this actually a threat? And they will do, they'll ask their professors, their coaches, look at prior discipline records, and actually create a plan to keep them safe in that environment. And so, from Virginia Tech, we learned, as I mentioned, about mass notification, breaching tools, physical structures and things like that to keeping schools safe. I would add that I think the federal, the state passing of threat assessment, threat management for all schools is the biggest highlight that we should be remembering, because it's one of the most committed to preventing these attacks from occurring in the first place. If you're curious, obviously they're called sometimes different things depending on the institution. Usually it's a care team, a behavioral intervention team, and things like that. As I'm sure many of you know, but Connecticut and Illinois currently have laws as well for higher ed. I believe Florida and Oregon are also in different processes to move towards that direction. From the community engagement piece, one of the critical parts of threat assessment to make it successful in that space is what is the quality information that they receive from their constituents. I say constituents, I mean just the public that they live with. So when I'm evaluating a new college, let's say it's a higher ed, I look quite literally at how quickly I can find information on your website about reporting behaviors. And I have to keep in mind that I know what to Google and what terms to look for, but does the average parent know what to look for, the average student, if they've never heard of a bit team, for instance? So as kind of quick homework, I would ask you, as you go back to your teams, or if you have a similar kind of process and policy in place, is how do you publicly talk about these cases that are averted? I think the depth and the quality of the data that the Averted School Violence Database has is magnificent, because there's pretty good information about the roles and how it's able to be stopped. But in your respective cases, are there interesting averted attacks or whatever the issue might be that you could pitch to a newspaper, for instance, your college newspaper, that you could write into a blog post. What this happens is it reminds your members of that space that, that things are occurring. And they're not only hearing about the large mass casualty events, but they're hearing about the lower level behaviors as well that might be domestic or suicide or whatever else in case. But to do those via very kind of more positive tones and finding perhaps survivors in your own spaces that could give testimony to that. Unfortunately, as more attacks occur, it's very likely that you will have survivors in your community, as I often come across this as well. And then on a more kind of policy level as well is from the campus police department, threat assessment team, how well do you market, how do you communicate, how do you share information? Often, we say to call law enforcement if an attack, or I'm sorry, if you have information, but it's not always sufficient. We've been trained to call 911 only mostly in last resort emergency situations, and how do they contact you if it's just my roommate is being a little bit strange, right? The words that the public will feel and understand are different than the ones that the judicial process may take forth. So I know this is kind of hard to push. This is more cultural pushing of either doing in-person training, encouraging faculty to include information about reporting behaviors in a syllabus, website resources, obviously going in person, doing faculty and staff meetings, and video as well as is possible. A couple of resources, if these are helpful. The first one is if you're curious to learn more about threat assessment and management on a kind of a practical level, this is, I'm not going to lie, this is a very kind of thick, heavy kind of textbook reading, but it's a wonderful resource for threat assessment in different environments, whether it's on a terrorism level, on a kind of policy, Congress type of things, and it speaks to just how the history and the origin of it written by different individuals. There is some school focus as well. The middle one is Salem, Oregon has been, just outside of Portland, has been a model for K-12 using the Salem-Kaiser model, and a lot of school districts are picking this up as well. If you're in a space where you do not have the resources to have your own team on a school-by-school level, this model allows you to train everyone on the basics of threat assessment, but then has a district team that would answer concerns or cases that rise to a higher level. And that's a book that you can look at there. The Association of Threat Assessment Professionals is one of the best resources. It's a professional network, and they have conferences, chapters, and regional trainings as well on. They publish research, or the speakers will publish research and findings, both actual case studies, but also just actual research on averted and successful attacks. And this is a great networking opportunity because you will meet people there that just, as you can imagine, come across the most interesting, diverse, scary types of cases, and they will give you reference and help on how to manage potential threats in your community. And as I mentioned, their cases work everything from the large ones that we hear about, from the Aurora movie theater shooting, to much smaller but equally important ones as well. So highly encourage you to look at ATAP. Their annual conference is in Anaheim, California every year. The Behavioral Analysis Unit of the FBI also recently put out this report, Making Prevention of Reality. For those of you that probably know, but the FBI will do training as well and consult on much more kind of higher, more extreme cases if need be. But this is a great resource to share with those that might be part of your threat assessment team. It has examples of previous school attacks, what was done in those cases, as well as kind of an outline of how a threat assessment would work in a school setting. This is a resource that my foundation actually recently created. This is very new, and so if you have any, I would welcome any comments, any suggestions on this. What this is a pamphlet for either current or prospective parents and students of what to ask of their institutions. And so it tries to look, we try to look beyond, just the things you'd see in a college visit and tour, but have parents understand what an annual security report is, for instance, or what a threat assessment team might do, and what and how to find those resources in a faster way. So if you would like to receive a copy of this, please email me afterwards. And if you have any questions or feedback, I would greatly appreciate it. I also helped create a mobile technology called LiveSafe. So we started this shortly after the Sandy Hook school shooting in 2013. It's a mobile technology, and we're hoping to increase information about safety-related concerns. So one part of it is what you see here, which is an application. It's a mobile app that the student, parents, community member would have on their phone, and people can report information, everything from facilities to, just someone selling drugs in a space, or just a question that will go directly to their campus law enforcement or dispatch. We try to increase more information by allowing them to add pictures, video, all while tracking their location. It's a two-way process. So we very quickly try to thank the individual and give them as much information as possible about what actually happened to that report. There's also some emergency management features that are built in that would allow, for instance, text to 911 in through the mobile application. We are in hundreds of schools across the country, and so if any of you on the call are also as parents, if you download this application, just type in LiveSafe in Google or the iTunes store, you will see every school that we're in. You can then go in and actually access their emergency management plans, their active threat protocol. Schools put in a lot of additional information, so it's a more comprehensive safety source versus just for sharing information in that regard. Kind of as takeaways and things that I would hope that people obviously going to take away from our story is, I think Virginia Tech, unfortunately, is a great case of an example of what happens when we are not able to help to avert or prevent an attack. And so I ask you to use our stories, but really also some of the data that's collected by the Averted School Violence Database. We need more information, more understanding of these attacks to help increase people's understanding, but also their sense of self-efficacy to help prevent and to respond and to speak up in these. And whatever role that you sit in as a dean of students, as a campus law enforcement, as a parent, I urge that you help change the narrative as well, to the sense that we can prevent, that culturally these attacks don't have to occur, that people don't snap, and not to focus on the individuals themselves, but on the survivors and the communities that live with this for a longer term. And just lastly, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Gift of Fear, a great resource as well for your parents, your students as well, to help them reinforce the sense of personal responsibility and for safety. And so, yeah, thank you all very much for the time. And again, I just hope that we continue to talk about prevention, and we hope to continue to add more cases, more data to the database to make it as successful as it possibly can be.
Thank you, Christina. And Frank and Jeff, you're still there. We're going to go through a whole bunch of questions that have come up in the past in the past hour and a quarter. Christina, students can often see and experience potential safety concerns and issues before a campus police or threat assessment team is aware of them. How can we help encourage students to be more informed and hopefully proactive in speaking up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think by making a plan, quite frankly, it's a marketing plan for how we're going to educate them throughout the year of what to report and how to report. I know a lot of people are kind of getting away from making specific lists of certain behaviors because you don't want them to triage the behavior by themselves and think that if it doesn't meet, these are 3, 4, 5 criteria, that they shouldn't speak up about the report. But it's getting in front of them, at the beginning of the year, throughout the year, and as other cases or opportunities might present themselves, to say that, whatever information that you might have, we're happy to take your phone calls, your emails, come in person. One thing I advocate for is, you don't have to, we definitely want you to share as much information as you can. But if you're just going to call and speak to your threat assessment lead or the campus police and say, here's what I'm seeing, what would you do with this information? And just see how they respond to that. And to be frank, the response on that has been varied. Obviously, a lot of campus police, they want all the information at the time, but we have to understand that people will not often be comfortable with sharing that for different reasons. So, I think going back to encouraging faculty to include information on their syllabus, using social media, inviting law enforcement into our spaces, and by offering them multiple opportunities and ways to report, whether it's a phone call, a Google, a doc and a link, as well as mobile platforms like LiveSafe that I just mentioned. You have to, every single person will have their own point of access to this, but let them know that it doesn't matter how you report, just that you report, and that it would get to the right source at the time. In order to build that trust, we do have to open up a little bit of that tendency to not want to talk to them about what happens with the information or how many cases we worked, and I would say that, that's a stretch that we can make. I think that's a relationship that we can open up and have them report more to us.
So a related thread, Donald Tinney wondered, given the statistics about current students helping to avert 76.5% of plotters' plans, what resources are available for schools to develop see something, say something programs for schools? Donald then said, I second the question, what can we as K through 12 administrators use to promote and actually create an anonymous reporting mechanism? And TG chimed in, actually, I'm sure the higher ed folks could use this too. I suspect all three of you may have something to say about this. Who would like to go first?
Steve, this is Jeff. I'll gladly jump in on that. There are certainly a number of anonymous reporting systems out there. The one that we have worked most closely with is Safe to Tell out of Colorado. Susan Payne, who retired from the Colorado Springs Police Department and created Safe to Tell and ran it out of the Attorney General's office in Colorado, is now with Safe and Sound Schools. And so if you're especially in the K through 12 sector and would like more information on anonymous reporting systems, then I would encourage you to reach out to Safe and Sound Schools. And what they basically preach, and I think Christina was sort of getting at it too, you can't just plaster posters up around the school and say, here's a phone number to call. You really have got to work and develop a culture of trust in the school so the students and faculty will, in fact, use the system you develop. I know Susan Payne uses the term fidelity a lot, and that is ensuring the fidelity of these programs so that they aren't just checking off a box.
Frank or Christina, would you like to add to that?
Sure. So I think Jeff is right. There are a number of reporting mechanisms out there that probably, instead of trying to create your own, it's easier and more efficient to buy them. We at the Center for Mass Violence Response Studies are familiar with Christina's app, as well as an app called Totality, which has been created by an organization called ClearPath Alerts. We also work very closely with an organization, a company, private company, BARK.US. They're a social media monitoring company, again, thinking about prevention. And so you can subscribe to become a participant in BARK. They monitor your children and other students with permission, social media activity. They're looking, obviously, for a variety of patterns that could point to potential violence within the school or against an individual with suicidal ideology. So there are a number of different softwares out there. There are different capabilities. I think the important thing is to have one, to be very familiar with it, to make sure faculty, student, and parents are familiar with it, and to test it. Too often we develop emergency plans, we develop these warning systems, and we never test them. And they need to be tested on a very, very regular basis. We do a tremendous amount around fire drills and hurricane preparedness and tornado preparedness. We're doing better with active shooter. But I think just practicing using the systems, building familiarity and comfort with the systems, regardless of which one you purchase, is incredibly important. I think the other thing, and I alluded to this before, is you have to show people where there's been some wins. We have a story from an incident on the Averted School Violence Database where a student indicated that one of their fellow students had brought a gun to school. The short version is the student was confronted, the gun was recovered, the student was referred to law enforcement officials, and a year later was able to come back and complete the student's education at the same school, graduate, and has enjoyed a very successful life. So telling those stories of success where people are helped by intervention, that are helped by reporting, encourages particularly young people to feel that they can be in a trusting relationship and that there can be positive outcomes other than just somebody getting in trouble all the time.
Anything to add, Kristina?
No, I would add, I would definitely agree with both of those points. I would just add on the kind of which tool, which reporting you use, which tool for anonymous reporting, I would just look very closely at how they engage the community and how they actually, what's the marketing plan, what's the process to be out there, and how much information are they really receiving. And to echo Jeff's point, yes, safe to tell in Colorado, because they also guarantee anonymity, is a wonderful kind of resource looking at that. It comes down to how you want to structure it, where the funding obviously comes from, and things like that. But being very, holding those metrics and tracking them throughout the year so that you can show to your organization as well, here's all the information that we're collecting, and showing the value and the helpfulness of those reports is very important.
Kristina, Susan Graham said, what is the name of the pamphlet? I think she's referring to this one here on slide 44 that I just went back to, although you did have a couple of other pamphlets that you referred to. And then Nicole says, Kristina, will the Building a Culture of Campus Safety pamphlet, which is this one, be sent out to Koshka Foundation to the Koshka Foundation mailing list?
Yes, correct. Yes, it will be. We're going to put it to the website here very quickly because it's a fairly new pamphlet product. I don't want to publish it too soon. I'm happy to, if you email me, please, after the webinar, I'll happy to send it to you today via email. But we'll also put it through the website here very shortly.
And let me move ahead, since we're referring to contacting folks. Here's the contact information so that you have it in front of you. We touched on this, but here's a slightly different twist on it, I think. How can security professionals, and I think the focus is on security professionals, change the dynamic from react and respond to being preventative? Meaning, how do security professionals get into the mentality of getting ahead of risks and potential threats to avoid security and safety incidents? Who wants to dive in on that?
This is Christina.
Go first. You gave me last time.
Okay. I think, somebody used the word trust, right? It's trust in relationships, in being credible. And it's really investing that time to get to know all the students on your campus as best you can, or within your area of jurisdiction. Building that trust and looking at this is a proactive process of helping individuals that are already successful, that are doing well, but maybe taking that extra moment to reach out to somebody who starts to drift away from the crowd, who maybe is showing signs of challenging behavior, who makes people aware that there's been some type of life crisis. I think just taking that extra step of caring and trying to embrace that person and connect them to services is probably the most important foundational preventive step that we can do in this business.
And Kristina, you...
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I would just add that I think on a large scale, law enforcement are bought into this sense of prevention, and that they participate in their threat assessment teams and threat management teams, just at different levels. So I think part of it is education to them. Obviously, just by nature of their work, they're going to be very focused on the response and those types of questions. That's where they have to put a lot of their energy and training. But if we in the community as well, thank their efforts, appreciate their efforts, not only when an attack actually is occurring, but again, going back to sharing the stories of prevention, or sharing that, they stopped that traffic accident from getting worse, whatever it may be, that we become partners with them. I think that will help motivate them as well to continue to be supportive in that way. But I do want to mention, in all of these cases, law enforcement are part of the threat assessment team. It's just making sure that everyone knows that this process exists and that they're a critical piece of that.
Thanks, Kristina. Frank, going back to a slide from long ago, Monique Boudreau wondered how many of the 51 cases that you reported on were K through 12 versus higher ed?
I saw that question. I don't have the answer right off the bat, but if Monique sends me an email, we will get her that answer, and we can also get it back to you, Steve, so you can share it. No, I apologize. I just don't know the answer.
Thanks very much. TG said, we are using the SRP from I Love You Guys Foundation, and it had great results and feedback from our students. Are there any other suggestions for getting student buy-in to the process? And Tom Davis said, we use a reporting system called Maxient at our college. It can be used for all incidents and can be anonymous. Does anybody want to comment on either the I Love You Guys facility or Maxient or anything else?
This is Christina. Those are both wonderful tools. Maxient is more of an internal-facing software that the school would use to manage the cases, but they have an external web link that you can customize. That's what you would point your students to to report the information. I work very closely with the Love You Guys Foundation, and they're wonderful as well. They have resources. It's primarily kind of K-12, but their unique focus is that they have a lot of videos, posters, different training guides for how to speak to different ages about different types of threats, whether it's a lockdown or lockout and things like that. So they've put a lot of time into the messaging of how to sell this to your community. I think as far as they've drafted letters for parents that you could send out about the different protocols and trainings that their child may receive. So I think they're both wonderful. They're just a little bit different pieces of the puzzle.
Catherine Juswin said, I'd encourage also to tell students to expect that when they report their concerns that the parties taking the information will probably be asking a lot of questions back. This isn't to cast doubt, but to be thorough. So many scared students feel like inquiry means that no one believes them. Not really a question there, but Christina, I wonder if you have a reaction to that.
I am so sorry, Steve. I was just doing what you told us not to do, and I was reading a chat. So I apologize. Thank you.
I will absolutely read it again. From Catherine Juswin, I'd encourage also to tell students to expect that when they report their concerns that the parties taking the information will probably be asking a lot of questions back. This isn't to cast doubt, but to be thorough. So many scared students feel like inquiry means that no one believes them. And I say there's no question there, but I wonder if you have a reaction to that.
No, absolutely. Catherine is absolutely correct of either that no one believes them or that they're going to then use that person's information or name and then tell that to the potential, whatever the threat is, you say, your friend, ratted you out or whatever that is. And I think absolutely that having that sensitivity and that forethought to educate them in advance of here's what happens when you'll share information with us and here's the process. And they don't need to know the full steps of your threat assessment, but they need to know that something will be done with it. And even if you can't tell them, the outcome, sometimes the individual they reported will stay in that school, right? And so it's a lot of fear management to say that, we've taken these steps. Please know that you can come to us at any time. And that's why I have so much respect for the people that do this work. So thank you, all of you, because I know that it's an ongoing process in responding to these threats. But yes, it's alleviating the concern and not telling the parents or the students that they're wrong or they're overreacting. It's just, calmly thanking them and giving them as much as they can. Because at the end of the day, that's the information that we want, right? We want it when it's a potential concern or just something that's iffy versus, I'm pretty sure someone's going to bring a gun tomorrow. That's going to escalate a much quicker response. And you have limited options as compared to 6 months prior, ideally. So.
Thanks very much, Frank, Jeff, and Christina, and thanks to all of our viewers and questioners from all around the Internet. Check the NCCPS webinars page in the next week or so for a link to the captioned recording of today's presentation, as well as a link to our speaker's slides. If the brief evaluation survey I mentioned earlier should already be in your mailbox, it will take you no more than 2 minutes to complete. Please do. We read and act on your comments. The next Campus Public Safety Online is Tuesday, February 19th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Our speaker will be Jarlath O'Neill Dunn, Director of the Spatial Analysis Laboratory at the University of Vermont, on the topic of unmanned aircraft systems on campus. The registration URL is on your screen and clickable, or surf on over to the National Center webpage at nccpsafety.org. That's nccpsafety.org. Campus Public Safety Online is brought to you by the National Center for Campus Public Safety with support from the University of Vermont Continuing and Distance Education and the U.S. Department of Justice. Special thanks today to Andrea Young and Dan Cardella. This is Steve Worona. See you next time on Campus Public Safety Online.